Hello and good morning. Good morning, Senator. I know that we want to talk about the conflicts that are happening across the globe, primarily with Ukraine and Iran and the US, Ukraine and Russia, and Iran, US, and Israel. So I know we want to go ahead and jump into that because there is a lot to talk about. So good morning, and let's just get started.
Good morning, Morgan. We'll start off with Ukraine, and there have been some important developments. Sometimes the Ukraine war has gone on so long. It's a proxy war in which the United States has mustered the NATO countries to attack Russia, and we're 4.5 years into the war. Tremendous death and destruction. Totally needless war. Absolutely no reason this war had to start. But in any event, there are some important developments. One of the most important, I believe, is the fact that Russia, which for reasons that are unclear, they have been reticent to blockade Ukraine. And so Ukraine has major port facilities around Odessa and surrounding ports. And what has happened is the Russians have shifted attention, and they have launched attacks that have effectively blockaded the Ukrainian ports. And so there's a report out of Reuters just a day or two ago, and it says that it's entitled Ukraine's Farmers Despair as Russia's Black Sea Blockade Traps their Harvest. Now, Ukraine is a major exporter of grain, and their grain exports fell by 75% in the first 2 weeks of August. Ukraine is among the world's largest producers of wheat, corn, sunflower seeds, and about 90% of all of its exports go through the Black Sea, which is now fairly well cut off. So the farmers are saying that our finances have ground to a halt. There are no exports, and since there are no exports, there's no money for next week's crops. Now, Ukraine has also been attacking Russian ships for quite a while. They've been fairly effective with it, and but this blockade of Odessa I think, is a very significant point in the war. I won't call it a turning point, but it's a major type of situation that they face. So that is a very large issue. And then the next issue that I would mention is that Ukraine is no longer able to shoot down the Russian ballistic and hypersonic missiles because the Iran, we've elected to fight two major wars simultaneously. They weren't thrust on us. We made a decision. We're going to fight two wars. We're going to go in two different directions. We could have ended the Ukraine war. Instead, we decided we're going to keep pushing it forward. And we certainly never had any need to make war on Iran. So what we're doing is we've depleted our Patriot missile supplies. Patriots seem to be the one missile that can knock down the hypersonic missiles and the Russian ballistic missiles. Ukraine used to knock down 70 or 80% of the missiles, and now it's effectively zero. Now they're still able to shoot down long-range drones and cruise missiles pretty much as before, but the ones that are most damaging are the ballistic and hypersonic missiles. So that that's sort of where we stand with Ukraine.
Yeah, I think it's important to speak about the blockade. A lot of focus is on the blockade or the conflict with Iran, the U.S., and the blockade in the Strait of Hormuz, but the global ramifications that are going to come from what's happening with Ukraine and Russia as well. With this blockade, you just talked about the importance of the exports that Ukraine does. A lot of their main exports are wheat and corn. So this is going to have global impacts on the food that we get in other countries like Africa, all that. We talk about fertilizer. So I think that's very important that these both things are happening simultaneously, and it's going to have implications years down the road.
Yeah, this is true. Now, what's interesting is that Ukraine their exports of corn constitute about 10% of the world's exports. And those are going to be substantially cut off. At the same time, Russia is a major exporter. I don't have a figure. It may not be as large as Ukraine, but it is large. So when you put together those two wheat and corn exporters, vegetable oil exporters, you're talking about a pretty significant hit to the world's food supplies. And as you mentioned, particularly in Africa, a great portion of their food supplies does come from that area, from Ukraine and from Russia. So this is going to be driving up the price of food, and certainly we ought to close this war down. If we would stop throwing gasoline on the fire would burn out. It's that simple. The U.S. plans the attacks. We have our satellites, telling the Ukrainian forces where to go, what sites to hit. We got the CIA working for them, and if we just cut it out, tell them, okay, look, we're finished with the war. You need to come up with an agreement and wrap it up. It would happen, but we have not. I guess there are elements that still want the war to proceed. I know, it's a little different with the Republican and the Democratic Party. The Democrats are very much against the Iran war, and I'm not at all in favor of the Iran war. But on the other hand, the Democratic Party is all in for Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're kind of schizophrenic about this thing. And if it's, I wish that President Trump would just make a decision and say, look, we got to cut this thing off.
Yeah.
It's hurting us in so many ways.
Mm-hmm. I do have in the past done some lobbying with Doctors Against Genocide, meeting congressional members directly and talking about their policy, primarily in Gaza, with not holding Israel to their what they agreed on with the ceasefire is one that we spoke extensively about with our representatives. Even the laws that they themselves have to abide. The most kind of prominent one that people talk about is the Leahy laws. And one thing that would strike me is sometimes they would speak about, there was a shift in posturing after Biden administration and in the Trump administration. You had a lot more coziness with the Democrats and willingness to be receptive to this message, but would kind of be in the stance that they can't do anything because they're not in power. But one interesting aspect would be the talking points on Ukraine, how Ukraine is also going through, we have to be at Ukraine's back, and what the current administration is doing, not allying with Ukraine, is just a crime of humanity on their own is kind of what they would portray it as. But there was one congressional member that I went into their office. We spoke to them directly, and he had presented on his desk. So it was very important to him, a picture of him and Zelensky handshaking. And it was it's a very interesting thing when you go into the halls of Congress. You see these posters on the outside of their offices. I stand with Ukraine, I stand with Israel. And there is just this devoid of what the actual people within their districts that they were sent there to represent actually need. It is just this veneer of, I'm with on the right side of history, however they want to look at it, when they're projecting their allegiance to another country and basically boasting about it. So it's completely insane to me. I remember looking at that picture and I just thought it was just so insane, because you have a congressional member who was sent there by the people of his district. And I'm not going to name names or name states or anything, but instead of having, a picture of some of their community leaders or anything, it was a picture of a foreign head of state that he was basically declaring was more important to him than a bunch of other causes. So I think that that's very important, that you have this push in Congress where they are steadfast in their allegiance to maintaining this bloodshed.
Yeah, what you're saying is it's very enlightening, isn't it? When you walk the halls of Congress and you can actually see the hard evidence right in front of you, and you realize that these guys are bought and paid for by countries. They're recycling money one way or the other. It's a deeply corrupting thing. You wish they would have a big sign up there that says, "I stand with the American people."
Yeah, it is very shocking. Right after October 7th, there would probably pretty much majority of the congressional members had those signs out, and just like the Ukraine one as well. So it's very strange to witness, because it's this war push that is just so insatiable that they don't even understand what they're signing up for, but they're just doing it blindly. And you can sit there and present the facts to them, and it's just they have no waver. Like you said, maybe they are bought and paid for. Maybe they genuinely believe they're doing the good thing. But it's very, very strange to see this this wave of consensus that this needs to continue, even though they've continued primarily with Ukraine, for the past of almost 4 years now, of the same policy of continuing to arm Ukraine. Ukraine, we know at this stance, they are forcefully admitting men into the battlefield, high ages, not young men. Most of the young men have either fled or most of them have died in this war. The majority of Ukrainians that don't even want this war. There was, at the very beginning, you had at the western side of the Ukrainian country, you had primarily a large consensus. They wanted this war. They wanted to defeat Russia. Now the entire country is basically saying, we need to restart peace talks, which is very significant. That even the Ukrainian people, if our representatives would just listen to the actual people they are subscribing to help and bring sovereignty to, they are going against even their needs, which is crazy to think about, because it's like, okay, they go against our needs. We understand that. We've understood that for a very long time, but they are doing it in this prospect of going and helping other people in other lands and their aims and their goals, and then they're not even listening to them. So what is the true ideology that's being pushed here? They're not even listening to the Ukrainians and their wants.
Yeah, there are immensely wealthy people, globalists, Zionists, who stoked the war in Ukraine and the war in Israel. And these are often money-making proposition. They've put a lot of money into Ukraine. They want a return on the dollar. And, so that's the reason that this thing goes on. And ordinary people, the man in the street, you can't keep up with this stuff. You can't follow this. It's like, with all the work that I did in Syria, I understand extremely well what's going on there. 10 years after Al Qaeda brought down the Twin Towers, killed 3,000 Americans, we gave ourselves over to an unwavering alliance with Al Qaeda, the very people who had killed the Americans. Mm-hmm. And we set up, under Project Timber Sycamore, we set up warehouses just across the Syrian border in Turkey, and they were run by the CIA, and they funneled the weapons to the terrorists who conducted one of the most vicious campaigns in military history, beheading literally tens of thousands of prisoners of war, civilians, and they conducted a mass rape campaign that probably has not been duplicated since the very end of Second World War in Prussia, where the Soviets came in and conducted a vast rape campaign. It was so bad that the parliament and the president of Syria worked cooperatively to enact law that would prohibit or that would keep these jihadists from around the world from claiming the children that they had fathered through rape. They had to change the citizenship law of Syria because there had been such a vast number of impregnations of women by jihadists that the CIA was helping to recruit. Today, we are shaking hands with al-Shara, who had a $10 million bounty on his head as an especially dangerous terrorist, the original founder of Al-Qaeda in Syria, who was in charge during all of this. So the American people, they don't know. They just hear, oh, well, there was a bad regime that was put out, and here we've got this fellow al-Shara, and look at him, he's in a suit and tie. He must be all right, right? Mm-hmm. But he's slaughtering. We used to be gaga over the Kurds. The Kurds need their own country. They're so wonderful. Boom, we cut off the Kurds like they had never existed. You never hear a word, a whisper of the great Kurds. And once we decided that we had what we wanted, Al-Qaeda was in charge of Syria, nothing. So, and the American people, there's no way, unless you have lived through this. I began studying it before the war in Syria began, because I started with studying what was going on with the attack we had launched on Libya. And we were going to bring democracy to Libya. And what has happened? There has never, ever been a presidential election. Basically, it's just sort of a big thuggish dictatorship.
Yeah, it's a failed state. Yeah, it's completely atrocious what happened to Libya and many other nations as well, with this continued interventionist policy that seems to have other aims other than bringing sovereignty to people. It has, like you kind of stated, it's within big business, and you need to have an enemy to continue to make these weapons, drop these weapons, have continued, conflict overseas where we can generate public interest, which I think personally is waning. I think with my generation, we grew up with the 20 years of Afghanistan, the Iraq War, that seemed that, the American people were largely misled in why that was necessary. And, we're not ignorant to the fact that a lot of the same talking points that got us into Iraq are being recycled to the, the Iran conflict. They have weapons of mass destruction, and now we've kind of dropped the weapons of mass destruction and its importance. And now we're talking about how we have to open the Strait of Hormuz that was open prior. which I know that's kind of what we want to pivot to, is a lot of what's going on with Iran and the U.S. And, we had the memorandum of understanding, and that seemed to fall apart just as quickly as it was made, it seems.
That memorandum, that was sort of a spark of hope. J.D. Vance and Kushner, anyway, a couple of them negotiated it. It would have worked. It would have gotten us out of that thing, and people would have moved on. They wouldn't have thought twice about it. They wouldn't have said, "Oh well, Trump could have whooped up on these people," and they just move on because life goes too fast.
Mm-hmm.
It would have been, for the Republic. I'm a Republican. For the Republicans, it would have been, sort of a door out of this trap, and then it didn't last for any time, and unfortunately, we don't understand as Americans that people on the other side of the wars we fight have feelings, they have emotions,
Mm-hmm.
And if you have the person you're negotiating with on the other side constantly calling you thugs, saying that nobody's in charge, bragging about how many people you've killed, how many leaders you've killed, I got to tell you, that's not the way to seal a deal with a party where you're hoping to come to an agreement and you're hoping to put to rest, bad feelings and so forth. So what's happening now in Iran is that President Trump vowed that now he's going to maintain this naval blockade indefinitely.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to just go on ad infinitum. And Iran, I tell you, Iran's strategy is very clear. It's rather simple. The strategy is an eye for an eye. When the other side threatens something, you threaten. When the other side launches an attack, you launch an equivalent attack. And we haven't been able to I don't think we've quite grasped their strategy, although it's fairly elemental. So Trump said, "Oh, look, I'm gonna blockade that Strait of Hormuz, and we'll just keep it indefinite." They have now come and said, Iran has said that Iran will block the Strait of Hormuz until Trump leaves the White House, and they can do it. Mm-hmm. Now, the Executive Intelligence Review, very, very fine intelligence reporting service, they said that they did a report that says the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, has been shocked by the speed of the Iranian recovery from the bombing campaigns. They quoted a Brigadier General Mohammed Naqvi,
Mm-hmm.
advisor, the commander of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and he spoke to PBS NewsHour August 11th, and he said, "Look, this country is vast. We can make missiles securely wherever we want." And this is one thing that we haven't recognized. We're not dealing with a little country
Mm-hmm.
that's hemmed in. This is a vast country, and the Jerusalem Post on August 13th ran an article that said Israeli defense officials have been shocked by the speed of Iran's recovery following the early 2026 war. Quote, "The IDF is now seeing a stunningly speedy turnaround in many areas, including the ballistic missile threat." So the Israeli intelligence, you never know what their intelligence really says versus what they are telling the White House, it says. But I suspect there's a little bit of two things. One is they're very two-faced, very deceptive when they convey their view of the intelligence. And also, I suspect that they're a little bit of a victim of their own hubris, that there's a tendency, I controlled the most bombing strikes of any air controller in the 1st Marine Division. And this was during the phase when I was there. And one of the things that always struck me, because I was on the ground, I was patrolling. Often we were attacking after we launched bomb strikes. And when bombs are dropped, there's a jarring sound, just a shock that just sort of, you could feel it rattling your head. And you see these huge clouds of dust and earth thrown into the air. And then I can recall this one time in particular where we were with Charlie Company, 1st Marine Regiment. We were fighting across a big open stretch of rice paddy. And on the other side, there was a very, very elite Viet Cong force. And so I was bombing the tree line where they were, and the bombs were hitting. They were hitting accurately. And then we moved in. They withdrew. We pursued. We were in a cat and mouse thing that went on for a week. And when we went through, I went and I inspected the enemy trenches. So they were very involved. And one of the things they would do is they'd have a trench line, and then off of the trench, they would do these little L-shaped holes that would go into the earth. And when we were bombing, they would go in and over. And so the blast from the bomb would travel down the trench line. And in order to injure the soldier who was there, the blast had to go down, turn left, turn right. And in the course of that, a lot of the force would dissipate. And so I noticed there were a couple of places where there were blood stains from people who had been killed. But it's my impression that most of the people there were not killed or wounded. So from the air, and especially now that we're taking these sort of electronic pictures by drone, a bomb drops and all of a sudden the screen sort of turns crazy colors and so forth. It doesn't necessarily mean that, that there's that much happening on the ground. Now, sometimes there is, but it's easy to overestimate what is happening with air attacks. And between Israel and the US, we bombed 30,000 targets. And at the same time, the missile production capacity of Iran has increased substantially as the bombs are falling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was quite an interview that they mentioned the PBS interview with the one of the top advisors to the commander, Mohammed Naqvi. I do have a portion of it. I wish I had pulled up the portion that you referred to, but this one is where he's asked kind of, one productive way to engage war, or I guess one intelligent way to engage in war is to place your mind in the minds of the enemy, your quote on enemy. So he asked this question to Mohammed Naqvi and asked him, to get in the mind of Pete Hegseth, and this is kind of his response. And I think I'll let it go a little further to, the question of whether or not, which is kind of being floated by some of the top officials in the Department of War, is the use of nuclear weapons as a ultimate option. So I think that's kind of important to play, and we'll talk about that. And then I also want to move to what's happening with their own soldiers during this war. I'm not sure if you had caught some of this news media coverage in the recent days. So I'm going to go ahead and play this, and then we'll kind of pivot to those points.
Officers often put themselves in the place of the enemy to maybe predict what they're going to do. Put yourself in Pete Hegseth's place. What is he thinking? What is your prediction as to what he might do?
I will never put myself in his place. He is a criminal who killed 168 innocent children. Not only do these people not work for the benefit of humanity, they don't even work for America. They work for their own interests. As soon as the stock market closes, they start hostilities. When the stock market opens, they send positive messages to raise stock prices. All the while, they are buying and selling the stocks themselves. If I was in the place of the American Congress, I would call for an investigative committee to compare the assets of Mr. Trump, his family, and his inner circle before the war to their assets after the war.
Many observers say Iran has put up a strong fight, but that America has one weapon that Iran doesn't, and that's a nuclear bomb. In your view, how likely is it for America to use a nuclear bomb?
Naturally, it can end up being a mistake for them. The morning after they use a bomb, all of America's military bases around the world would be occupied. Today, things are different than World War II. The people of the world have awakened. No one in the world will allow for such a crime to be committed, because the next time it could be themselves.
I think that's very important to play. We often do not hear from the enemy that we're fighting or vilify as the ultimate enemy. I think it was very important when Tucker Carlson went and spoke with Vladimir Putin and had that long, extensive interview. And that was one of the first ones that we had heard from since the Ukraine war on the perspective of why Russia is fighting. And I think that enlightened a lot of the public to what was truly happening. I think we get a lot of sanitized propaganda for this war, and to kind of hear directly from, the person that we're supposedly fighting. It's very, very interesting. We have a lot of American citizens who are completely against insider trading. They know it happens, with their congressional members or senators or representatives. We get completely disgusted by that. And to kind of hear him poke at one of those grievances that Americans hold is very, very interesting. What were your thoughts when you heard that?
Yeah, I think he is he's reflecting some of the concerns that American citizens have expressed. The Iranians do open source intelligence just like we do. Mm-hmm. Open source intelligence, by the way, it's not spycraft. It's simply relying on all of the published information that's available around the world. It's a fairly unique talent to have. It's, you have it, I have it. You have to be able to put yourself in the shoes of the other party, and you have to see things through their eyes. For example, when the first bombing strikes on Iran were launched, I spoke with an Iranian American who said that his parents were Iranian Americans, and they had been at the time living in Tehran. They were not particularly fond of the government, but they certainly were not revolutionaries. And he was speaking to his mother on the phone at the time, and suddenly she screamed, and the phone went dead. And it took a couple weeks before he could contact her. When he did, it turned out that they were in downtown Tehran. There was a very large multi-story building where there was one person that the Israelis wanted to kill. They dropped these powerful bombs and destroyed the entire building, killed everybody in the entire multi-story apartment building. And at the time of the blast, his mother had been speaking to him, and the blast blew out the plate glass window in their apartment building. These are modern apartment buildings, just like we'd find here in New York City. And anyway, she was cut up by the glass and blown away from the window. Her husband, who had been standing a little further back, was blown by the blast. He slammed into the wall that broke most of his ribs. And anyway, that when I spoke with this fellow, I said, "What's the mood on the street? What are the everyday Iranians feeling right now?" And he said, "Look," he said, "there was a lot of opposition towards the government. It wasn't revolution. It was just, like it is in this country. You have Democrats, Republicans." But he said, now, he said, everyone in Iran is united. They're being bombed, innocent people being killed. He said, there is no opposition now. And I think this is history. I mean, we saw the same thing at Pearl Harbor. We had lots of opposition to going to war with Japan or Germany, and we had the bombing, and all of a sudden there were no voices against war. And the same thing happened in the Battle for Britain, which was the great air campaign that Germany launched against Great Britain during the Second World War. And now Great Britain had a very powerful Nazi element, domestic, people from England who were Nazis, who were very committed to the belief in that ideology. But once the Battle for Britain started, it was gone. There were no more sympathizers with the Germans. And this is just the way human nature works.
Exactly. Yeah.
I wish that everybody in the CIA, and of course, I wish there was some way that somebody had control over Mossad to help these people understand that the people you demonize don't necessarily take in information and arrive at conclusions in ways that are dramatically different than you and I would. I may be, I may have feelings this way or that way, but when someone without the slightest provocation kills my wife, my children, my grandchildren, my parents, that's a totally new dynamic. And I know in the White House they don't understand this. And I don't believe that much of the intelligence agents, they're these people, I don't think they don't conceptualize that. They don't have it as a gut feeling. So it's a weakness for us, and it's one that sometimes leads us into very, very bad directions.
Yeah, it seems like we listen to the Israelis, a lot of their intel is often faulty. We have to kind of question whether they are doing it on purpose or not, because it seems like they often do it, and it seems logical to question even their kind of how they got to that conclusion of, the people would be screaming and rejoice in the streets if we, toppled the regime. By toppling the regime, we had President Trump tweeting about, bombing desalination plants, bridges, and these are civilian infrastructures that, if you walked to your house one day and your local pharmacy was being bombed, I don't think you would really care about the new ideology that was to be ushered in. You would see that it's an infringement on, you know, kind of your quality of life, and that is wrong. So I think you have a lot of people who will rally together during that when you have a foreign invader try and, you know, bring you sovereignty or, you know, your rights back is kind of what the U.S. has claimed. But we've completely dropped that narrative. We were back to, I guess, they cannot have a bomb, which was, you know, we've spoken about how that is a very strange one to grapple with if we recognize if Midnight Hammer was successful or not. It shouldn't be a question for a very long time whether they have the capacity to get a nuke. If we, you know, a lot of our intelligence agencies proclaim Midnight Hammer to be an ultimate success. We took out their facilities, and therefore the threat is annihilated. We don't have to worry about it. But here we are again with, you know, these continued operations, with that being the supposed goal that we have to take out their ambitions and aims to own a nuclear weapon, which I think it's interesting what he kind of said there is that this is a new world that we're in that, you know, may not be recognized by the people who are in the State Department and the Department of War, that people will not react the same way when you drop a nuclear bomb. You will have you know, mass people who will be in disgust and wanting to kind of take away your power if you know, exert that much power in dropping something as lethal as a nuclear bomb. You know, this engagement started, and it was said that it was going to only be a few weeks, that we would be finished in a few weeks, we would meet our goals, and therefore we don't need you know, a declaration of war from Congress, that within the rights of the executive branch, they have 60 days to conduct these operations if we're an imminent threat. So far, we have not had any credible evidence that we were an imminent threat, nor has this 90 days has lapsed multiple times. So much so that the USS Abraham Lincoln has been in the middle of the sea for over 200 days. So much so that you have Navy men actually throwing themselves overboard. I'm not sure if you had seen this article.
I've seen this, and while I'm just 100% against this war in Iran, I do think that some of that story is overhyped. This idea that people are jumping overboard, normal people don't do that. I don't care how long they've been at sea. I did notice that there was one fellow who jumped over, but he wore his life vest and he was quickly picked up. I know there's a certain degree of politics that are taking place. I looked up when I saw this. I was very interested in the length of time that the Abraham Lincoln had been at sea, and it is a long time. But I looked to see, is this a record? I was quite surprised because it's often talked about that way, but apparently there have been others that were out for a good bit longer, maybe like 25% longer, and not in the distant past either. But so I think there's a little bit of hype going on with that, but at the same time, I think the Navy is under a tremendous amount of strain because they just are being thrown from thing to thing. You know, they had a big naval force off Venezuela, and then the same naval force ended up going to aid Israel and taking over different countries. And so the Navy is under strain. I don't doubt that. I guess it's the particular story.
Well, that's I'm glad that you say that. I know that some of their frustrations are the lack of fresh produce. Sometimes I guess produce comes there and it's no longer good. a lot of things that are psychologically straining. I will say, the inability to see your family on a deployment. I think that was supposed to end. I can't remember the end date, but once that date had passed, they extended it, and they're kind of giving them no end date to look forward to. I think that does a lot to your psyche, as you have this goal. Okay, I meet this day, I get to go home to my family. I think you have a lot of people in the Navy who are even curious to what this goal is. What is the end post of what we're trying to achieve? It kind of seems like it's this just stalemate of we don't really have any particular goals, and just kind of get on board with it, which can do also a lot to the psyche as well, where you're questioning your role, and you took an oath to defend the Constitution against enemies, foreign, domestic. Give me a legitimate claim to be maybe not excited is the best word, but to be completely on board with fighting the quote on enemy that you want me to annihilate or take out. I think that is a lot, as well as you have a lot of, I spoke about people within my generation. A lot of them are going to be on that ship, in the 20s and 30s, and we grew up with the Iraq War, where a lot of us were deceived. So I think you have a lot that goes into play with that, where you have Americans who are questioning if they're being, lied to, or if they're doing the right thing. I think all that kind of plays into what may be happening on board the USS Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, one of the things, there was a brief time where President Trump was determined to send destroyers to accompany the oil tankers and to take them through the strait. And someone thought better of that, and I'm glad that they did, because the first time we did that, the destroyer that took the first ship through would have been targeted by a number of hypersonic missiles and ballistic missiles. And now the destroyers have a lot of air defenses, but they would have been overwhelmed. And were you to sink one major American warship, and say you lose, 80-90% of the all drowned at sea, I think it would bring home to America what is going on with these hobby wars that we're fighting. Yeah. And all of a sudden we say, my gosh, people really die in these things. And then people would say, wait a minute, what are we doing? What are we finding? Something about a nuclear bomb that they've been talking about for 40 years. Is that, what are we doing? And I'm not sure, considering that we started the war with the American public being very distrustful of the war. Americans have never liked the Iranian war. We've never convinced them that this was the thing to do. And if we were to lose a major warship and all of the sailors aboard, I'm not so sure that it couldn't bring down the government.
Yeah, I think you nail on a good point. Is this detached kind of feeling towards the conflicts that we engage in. A lot of what during the Obama wars, you had the drone warfare. So you had us kind of taking out people via drones. You had a lot of the soldiers kind of in a room where they would push a button. There was a lot of detachment from the actual, the heaviness of taking one's life. And, like you said, these people have feelings just like you and me. We might have the same goals. They might be an adversary, but they also have, family they go home to. A lot of so I think that is important that you nailed upon that, is that a lot of the American citizens, they don't really recognize the true toll of what's going on when we engage in these overseas. They see it with, they might question the Pentagon budget, that's, $1 trillion, or stuff like that. But they don't really see the true, kind of like what you said, if someone murdered your wife or something, it wouldn't really, all that political ideology goes straight out the window. It's human nature at this point. Someone that you care about was affected by this. And we have a lot more of that instances happening, which we started to kind of have that where we had some bodies coming home, but not at the level of if we were to do a ground invasion or something a lot more, like you said, if a destroyer was, attacked and you have 90 or 80, 90%, which is thousands of people completely gone, that is very heavy. And I don't want it to result in that to kind of what is the reason that wakes Americans up. I think that would be very unfortunate.
Yes, well, we'll see where it all leads. We are growing closer and closer to the midterms.
Mm-hmm.
Don't think we're going to have any resolution. And I think a couple of things that have sort of saved the Republican Party's bacon is the redistricting, doing away with the racially oriented gerrymandering. That's had a big effect. And the other thing is that I think because there is so much backlash against the Iranian war, it has allowed this democratic socialist movement
Mm-hmm.
to take hold in a very powerful way. And it's difficult for the Democratic Party to deal with because they have sort of pro-Israeli elements, because typically Jewish voters are Democrat voters. That's tradition.
Mm-hmm.
And so you've got a lot of leaders of the Democratic Party who are Jewish, or certainly they have lots of friends who are, and a lot of them are very committed to Israel. And then the Democratic Socialists is very opposed to all of the wars in the Middle East that we're fighting, and it's causing a clash that is it's just kind of mind-boggling to think, how do you bring these disparate groups together? So I think that will tend to level the playing field a little bit. It's almost anybody's guess where this thing is going to end up with the midterms. It looks like El Sayed is going to have real difficulties with his Senate race.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we'll see. I think the Republicans are very likely to hold the Senate, and the Democrats may not win control of the House by as large a margin as they had hoped. It may be a more narrow margin, but I could be wrong. I mean, politics is a very volatile topic, and we'll have to see the morning after what happens.
Certainly. And thank you, Senator, for your input today. I think it's very important kind of us drawing the connections between the engagements with the Russia and Ukraine and Iran, US and Israel. The implications, like you say, the blockade, the Russia's engaging on Ukraine, and then you have, the blockade in the Strait of Hormuz. A lot of this is going to affect not only Americans, but the entire globe. So I think that's very important for us to touch upon. And I want to encourage everybody to like and subscribe and tune in next week to focus on the news. So thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Morgan.